Thank you so much for the invitation. At the risk of becoming messy, I decided to change the start of this presentation due to the things that were discussed and debated during the morning. The first thing is to acknowledge the fact that people is moving towards cities, which could be good news and bad news. On the good news side, cities are magnets that attract not only people, ideas, knowledge, resources, and mainly opportunities. If anything, cities are concentration of opportunities, of jobs, education, healthcare, access to sanitation, transportation, even recreation. That's why people come to cities, looking for opportunities. The problem is that to the numbers that we're giving during the morning of the scale and speed of this process of migration towards cities, one has to add scarcity of means with which we will have to respond to this phenomenon. So to understand the pace of this event, of this phenomenon, we have to understand that nowadays we have a little bit more than 3 billion people living in cities, 1 billion under the line of poverty. By 2030, we will have 5 billion urban dwellers, 2 billion under the line of poverty. This means that we will have to build a 1 million people city per week, and this is the challenging part, with $10,000 per family. So it's not just the scale, speed, but also the scarcity of means what creates what we have been calling the 3S menace in the process of how to respond of people coming to cities. If we don't solve this equation of a 1 million people city per week with $10,000 per family, it is not that people will stop coming to cities. They will come anyhow, but they will live in awful conditions. That means that cities, besides being good news because of the amount of knowledge that it may be created and the wealth that it will be generated, cities at the same time may become social ticking time bombs because of the pressure that is going to be accumulating. Cities express in a very concrete and real way inequalities. The mayor was saying, let's try to address the question of inequalities. This is absolutely crucial for cities because what creates the tension and the friction in the city is not so much poverty, but the inequalities, the distance that do have access to the opportunities and those that do not have that access. And this creates the tension that we may be witnessing in the coming future. In any case, cities themselves can have or can become shortcuts towards equality. Maybe one of the few things that one listens when talking about inequalities is income redistribution, as if the problem of inequalities was an economical issue only. It's far more complex than that. It's political, it's social, it's religious, it's environmental. So these inequalities may be solved if we identify strategically projects in the city that can correct those inequalities without touching income, infrastructure, public space particularly, that is by nature redistributive. Cities are measured for what you can do in them for free. So if people do not have access to quality of life, having extremely powerful and quality, high standard quality public spaces may be a way to correct those inequalities, just to mention one. Public transportation, absolutely crucial. Without having to touch your income, not being able to buy the car or ride the highway, you can make the experience of moving around in cities a good one or an awful one. So cities can dismantle the ticking time bomb on the one hand, and infrastructure may be particularly powerful to do that. The $10,000 per family thing is mainly for housing, and this is what we have been trying to do in our practice in Chile at Elemental. I want to clarify that in infrastructure, I know really very little about it. That doesn't mean that we don't understand the importance of it. If scarcity of means is crucial in housing, it's not necessarily the case in infrastructure. The amount of investment that comes through infrastructure is huge. it's on the scale of the trillions, unlike in social housing, for example. So what was said in the morning, spend money wisely, it's important. Not just do wise projects, but if you're going to have the trillions, do not do stupid projects like a wall as an infrastructure to divide Mexico and the US. What is clear, in any case, particularly in infrastructure, is that the scarcest resource is not money, but coordination. Cities express the fact that what we will have to do to be able to respond to the challenges is to coordinate not just money, but the operation of all the stakeholders and agents in the city. So, the fact that we know very little about infrastructure requires us, and it is almost the case for every single project that we do, to be very rigorous with our ignorance. We try to put ourselves, and this is our entry point, in the place of the normal citizen. This is not that I have to act. I mean, regarding infrastructure, I'm ignorant, really ignorant, so I'm on the side of the citizen. Does this move like that? So, for a citizen, infrastructure is this collection of words. What we try to do is maybe on the answer side, one tries to apply specific knowledge. But before jumping into answers, it is crucial to identify what is the question. There's nothing worse than answering well the wrong question. So what is the right question regarding cities? Maybe a good starting point is to be in the place of a citizen that has to experience on an everyday life basis words like this. And this is what I, again, as reading the newspaper, get it, what is infrastructure. It's a collection of wires and cables and pipes that tend to be invisible, that conduct water, sewage, electricity, waste, all that kind of thing. It's streets, it's highways. Well, all these words that are sometimes concrete, sometimes fluid, sometimes is stuff, sometimes is a more abstract thing, is the way one should channel in the most efficient possible way those huge amount of money that goes into cities. The only thing that we try to do very carefully and rigorously is that we do have the problem of the blank page in front. So the way to deal with this is that of having the problem of making proposals, taking the risk of making a proposal. Of course, you have to understand the constraints and all the limitations, but we try to, as quickly as possible, overcome our ignorance by doing a proposal. We may fail, and we fail quite a lot, so we correct ourselves, and we iterate, and we ask people to make sure that what we were trying to propose was on the right line, or it was not. One of the things that I liked very much about the debate in the morning were how these forces at play of knowledge on the cutting edge connected to technology, development, or humanism, or let's say history, being another strong force at play. One of, I think, the most fascinating things nowadays is that, as never before, we are witnessing and experiencing 21st century software, and we're using those softwares, and we're taking advantage of them through prehistoric hardware. Our bodies haven't changed in thousands of years. But even more important than the fact that our hardware, the way we relate not only to technology but to others, is still very primitive, face-to-face contact. We read kind of information that is before language came into existence. Even more important than that is that the forces that drive the way we live together in cities are very primitive, archaic, I would call it even emotions, fear, anger, resentment, envy, desire, hope. So we will have, while dealing with cities, to be able to combine state-of-the-art knowledge. I mean, the more tools, the better. But know that the way we will relate to them is through this prehistoric hardware. And I think that this polarity It's part of the potential fertility of these utilities that infrastructure may become. So, while talking about primitive hardware, if the scarcest resource in cities was not money, but coordination, the most abundant resource in cities is going to be non-qualified labor. People that do not know any other thing to do than eventually build is one of the biggest forces that we will have to integrate into the equation, and hopefully, and this will be the point of the presentation, channel this huge force and this huge capacity of people to provide themselves with the right environment. What technicians have to do, and people in a position of power have to do, is provide the frame to coordinate and channel that individual capacity. So, to try to organize my own mind and that messy of the words that as a citizen one tries to or tends to connect with infrastructure, we thought, well, maybe this would be a way to at least understand where we can find opportunities and windows of opportunity to make proposals. Above all the infrastructure that we tend to see, one way to organize would be, well, is it going to be about the way private infrastructure, either existing, will have to be retrofitted, or the new one will have to follow a different paradigm, or the way public infrastructure will have to be changed while trying to update what the performance of those old infrastructures were, or the new ones to come may look like. So let's start with the private existing infrastructure. Might be that one of the biggest things that we will be offered as an opportunity is to go from this network of wires and pipes that either state control or big companies of utilities delivered to people, is to include and add off the grid whenever possible. It might apply to energy, it might apply to water, it might apply to waste treatment. As much as possible, let's try to be off the grid, and this might offer a big, not only opportunity for designers, but also for people to channel their own initiative. Let's consider energy, for example. The fact that we're moving from an electric to an electronic world that may require low voltage, that allows to be more efficient in the way of producing your own energy, solar, and then cost dropping might be one of the biggest things to add to the existing grid. The thing is that do not tax on top of our individual capacity if we're able to generate a contribution to the system in general. The same thing to water, how do we collect and we treat water, not to mention waste and recycling, not only water, but only sewage and garbage. A few examples that we have been trying to do to open the system and allow individual initiative to contribute to the big grid while reconstructing for the earthquake and tsunami in Chile in 2010. Or the way we're dealing with social housing, again, trying to be as much as possible off the grid. But more importantly, even after disasters, when you're off the grid, it's not just a way to retrofit existing infrastructure, but it's normally the way emergency housing works. You're off the grid by definition. So instead of being not only off the grid, but cellular, the same thing that was applied to phones, instead of trying to connect, and this takes time and takes a lot of money, can we deal in a cellular way with water, with waste, with energy? And that might be a way to make a more efficient use of or retrofitting the existing private infrastructure. What I think is the ultimate point in here is to try to channel individual initiative and allow it to add to the state and market resources that, for sure, with the numbers that we have witnessed during the morning, is not going to be enough. If we jump then to the existing public infrastructure, well, it's important to understand that normally those big infrastructural projects were designed and implemented in a sectorial way, meaning countries that did not have coverage of roads, houses, ports, and infrastructure that needed urgently to have that. So dividing by sectors the way of financing those infrastructural investments was very efficient. And this is what we have been witnessing the world over. The problem is that at the time, the coverage or the deficit was the issue. The questions that we have nowadays are not longer by sectors, but cut across. I mean, again, the scarcest resource is going to be coordination. To make a very simple project, we need to sit on the table 5 different ministries, and that was not the case 40 or 50 years ago. So what we'll have to do is to have multifunctional platforms instead of monofunctional hardware, and try not only to respond to needs, that was the 1.0 version, but include or add to needs desires. As important in our prehistoric hardware is not only to be able to solve basic needs and satisfy basic needs, but also to respond to the deepest, most mysterious condition of the human desire. These both drivers need to be integrated in our 2.0 infrastructure. In other words, we'll have to widen the spectrum to what we consider deliver basic needs, including desires in that. A couple of examples that I had the luck to witness at the Venice Biennale. Durban Warwick Triangle, an old infrastructure highway, never finished, abandoned, maybe the most dangerous part in the city, that was transformed not just in a movement or transportation infrastructure, it became a market, it became the black magic medicine hub, transportation hub. It's in the threshold of the countryside and the city. So what used to be a rather dangerous place became one of the most vital instruments in the city for delivering not just quality of life, but actually to create wealth. This was due to the very subtle intervention of just providing more connectivity, pedestrian bridges that were able to connect at a different level what the highway was trying to do at a metropolitan scale. What if we can consider sewage, a pipe, and also as a sidewalk, so that we have 2 things being simultaneously delivered, which is what Medellin, that was mentioned in the morning by Ricky Burdett. Old infrastructural water tanks that the municipality identified again as the most dangerous spots while looking at night at these dark places, and they asked themselves, what are these darkness, the sport that are without light? Well, they are the water tanks that are walled to prevent any kind of threat to poison the water, that kind of thing. Well, they realized that the reserve of public space, the only reserve of public space, was connected potentially to the water infrastructure, so they reshaped it in the form of public space and opened out as social centers. Again, one of the reasons why consistently crime rate has been dropping down and quality of life has been going up. The same thing in Medellin, where because they are able to coordinate so through what they call the EDU, Empresa de Desarrollo Urbano, the cost of coordination goes very low. A company that simultaneously can deal with transportation, sewage, water, electricity, and it's a way to provide access to these slums and favelas. Actually, this was Pablo Escobar neighborhood in Medellin that was completely transformed, and actually now we can visit it. A little bit like this multifunctional infrastructural operation was our own experience while rebuilding after the earthquake and tsunami in Chile. This was a city destroyed 80% by the tsunami that followed an 8.8 Richter scale earthquake. So it was mainly wiped out. While talking to people, again, to identify what was the question, the government wanted to jump immediately into the answer, meaning big wall, heavy infrastructure to protect the city against future tsunamis. What people said is that we are fine, we are very thankful for you coming here to try to solve this problem, but our real problem is not tsunami, it's public space, it's the flooding due to rain, is that the access to the river, that is the origin of the city, is not democratic. It's owned by a few private landowners. So whatever you provide, make sure that you do at least these 4 things and not just one. And actually, by adding money from all the 4 different ministries, we were able to pay for this park, as you see, and the construction is this laminating ponds, so that when the city was flooded every single year and was collapsing, so we can laminate the water before it collapses the city. But in addition to that, the idea was that against geographical threats, a tsunami, have geographical answers. A forest that, instead of resisting the energy of nature, dissipates its energy, introducing some chaotic movement into the waves. And by reducing that, we can protect the city for future. So that, in addition to provide that natural barrier between the threat and where the population is located, public space went from 2.2 square meters per inhabitant to 7 square meters per inhabitant, and guaranteeing democratic access to the river, adding a new road with new connectivity. And this has been expressed finally in people recognizing through their everyday experience of higher quality of life. In terms of what could be a private in terms of new infrastructure, the approach to the private infrastructure. Well, nowadays, it's a kind of infra, and it's called actually infra because it's embedded, it's not visible, we can't see it. It's somewhere there within the building, it's feeding the building, it's the blood in the system, but we can't see it. So could it be possible that instead of having it as infra, the future of it is have it as supra, in full sight, able to guide and frame individual action? This is actually not new. It is nowadays embedded and invisible somewhere within the street. It was not the case. It just used to be on the one side the infrastructure, on the other side the architecture. Or the same, we visited this actually before coming here to Madrid. It was very impressive to see on the right side the infrastructure, on the left side the architecture. So by providing multitasking platforms, could it be that it's not one or the other, but one and the other? And this might be crucial because the amount of what ultimately infrastructure provides, its coordination. It creates, and this is crucial, for these 2 billion people that will be under the line of poverty coming to cities, what is crucial is to have a clear property right. So to know what belongs to them and what's not, on the one hand, and what's the division between private space and public space, and we will see why that is crucial in the last part. So it was some time ago that we're not having enough resources, and it's clear that we won't deliver housing for everybody. Can we focus on what's more difficult to be achieved individually at a centralized level and have infrastructure not only delivering utilities, but eventually framing and encouraging individual action? Of course, you have to be open to lose control in the process, and maybe that's part of what we will have to integrate in this new paradigm. We will ignite a process, but won't control the outcome. We will just coordinate the forces at play. The same thing when we started with the social housing. At some point, we were just defining the property grid geometry, which cost nothing, and having sanitary booths in 2 stories in the front of the lot. Somebody said, well, this has been existing in the world since the 70s. The sanitary booth in the middle of the lot. This is part of Allende, for example, strategy. It was called chalk and land. We're just with chalk dividing clearly what's going to be private property and what's going to be public property. So the only thing that you did was to make the sanitary booth in 2 stories in the front of the lot. And that's exactly the point. It's not more than that, but it's not less than that. Design can play a role because by defining at least 50% of the urban front, you can negotiate and can coordinate the individual actions so that it becomes a customized piece of city instead of deteriorated neighborhood, which is the case when you allow individual initiative to go on its own. Individual actions, even if well-intentioned, cannot guarantee common good. And this is the role of design in channeling those forces at play. Finally, And this is part of something I would like to share, because it was discussed, and this was an important thing last year, the UN Habitat 3 gathering that happens every 20 years that sets the urban agenda for the world for the decades to come. The point was here that instead of looking at infrastructure as stuff, the hardware that you build, far more important than that will be what we don't build for the city in the future. So the void that we reserve, the same way there are ecological corridors, can we reserve civic corridors so that public space, which will be crucial in value gain and also in terms of individual family quality of life, can be reserved and can be guaranteed, even though we will have to allow these individual forces to enter the system. So one thing will be, given that void in the city, the space in between the buildings, everybody's competing for that, the key question, and for mayors, and this is an idea of Enrique Peñalosa, now re-elected mayor of Bogotá, and I mentioned Colombia because if they did it, I mean, nobody else has an excuse not to do it too. They had the worst conditions on earth. So if they were able to do it, well, everybody else in the world should be able to do it as well. We just have to frame the question in the right way. And the brilliance of Peñalosa is that he was saying, if everybody's competing for the space in between the buildings that we call street, the question for an authority is, how do I assign each square meter of that space? And he was saying, well, we should follow a priority of who has more citizens' rights. For example, we know that car usage of that limited space is very inefficient. That's how it looks when people are standing without using the device that we call car. So we have been witnessing things like that, to be able to not to opt one or the other, where buses and public transportation don't have to be instead of cars. But the point here is that we will have to establish a rank, priorities of who has more rights. And as Peñalosa was saying, in a bus, there may be 40, 60, 80 citizens. So a bus has 60 times more rights of passage than a car. Let's assign the limited amount of space to those means of transportation that have more citizens' rights. Bicycles may be as inefficient as a car. I mean, they're individual, but they use less space. So again, they end up being higher in the hierarchy of priorities of how to assign space. At the very bottom of the thing, no doubt, there will be cars and parking for cars. So be it driverless cars or driver-full cars, they're in any case at the very bottom of the scale of priorities of how to compete for that void in cities, and consequently, not just how to assign space, how to make investments should follow that same priority. And citizens do have a big right in claiming for being money channeled in a more efficient way, or in a way where civil rights are according to how space and money is allocated in that future void. Finally, one of the examples, and this was mentioned in the morning again, Manhattan. One of the most striking things is the proportion between public and public space. In Manhattan is close to 1-to-1. If you add all the sidewalks, the streets, the squares, and mainly the park, that proportion between private land and public space is close to 1-to-1. When you move to an informal settlement, a favela, that proportion drops to less than 1-to-10. And that makes that individual action is a threat against common good, even if well-intentioned. So, and this was a very short presentation for the UN Habitat 3 gathering. What could be a possibility, or how could design contribute to this kind of debate? Well, this being the current situation, imagine a mayor from a poor city that has this. He would like to provide formal housing, meaning access to sewage, water, clean water, electricity, to overcome a public health issue in the first place. So sanitation, access to sanitation as a human right before everything, but not having enough money. And what evidence shows is that in the best of the cases, that mayor will be able to assign 20% of the given space that municipality may have to public space and use, and because of the pressure, use the 80% that is left to accommodate people. And this is more or less what we recognize to be the trend nowadays in a way. Poor countries and poor states particularly, it's the question of the central operation of the state tends to deliver housing and cities for those that came looking for opportunities. So that mayor of that poor city that has, and this was the case of the mayor of Nairobi, $6 per inhabitant per year to spend in new cities. No wonder, whenever he's approached by a private developer, that it's very likely going to be a very mediocre one, that developer will offer, well, allow me to take care of that problem. And that mayor will say, okay, or the developer will ask, give me 20 hectares of land and I will solve the problem for you. That mayor will say, no way, I'm giving you at least 40. So he's trying to get away of as much problems from his shoulder as possible and will allow that developer to operate within its own rules. Those rules are more or less the same as that of the mayor, 20% of the land for public space, otherwise profit is not good enough, they don't even go into the business. So in terms of allocation of public space versus private one, we're pretty much somewhere in the same place. So is it possible that we make that poor city mayor with a mediocre private developer partner without changing their own rules of operating? It would be, and this is a very simple and modest design contribution, if that mayor would reserve these public space corridors that cost him almost nothing. Add to the 20% of the developer, we're already around in the 40% of public space, closer to the 1-to-1 ratio of Manhattan. But in addition to that, one would say, both to the mayor and the developer, do not finish your system. Leave it open as much as possible, at least 50%, so that people can channel their own resources. This will create the kind of diversity that we need in our cities to get away from the zoning, which is one of the worst things that have happened to our cities. And eventually, what all these things have in common is that, given the numbers that we're bringing, given the complexity of the issue, we won't solve it if we just rely on states or the market. Just try to be smart enough to include people's own capacities and resources and coordinate their action so they can add to the right solution, to the right question. Thank you so much.